everyone. Thanks once again for coming to the AOEC annual conference. This session that we've got with Katharine, I'm really personally looking forward to actually. Our speaker is for the session is an experienced executive coach and a member of the EMCC Research Ethics Committee. Community of practice, with more than 20 years of experience with Department of Trade and Industry. She started her own leadership consultancy business, working with a wide range of organizations, public, private and non-profit. With this background and experience, I'll leave the session to Katharine. She will focus on what it is like to be an internal coach within organizations, how to make it work, and what kind of challenges maybe they face throughout that journey. So please welcome Katharine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to see you all. So my name is Katharine Brooks. I've been an external coach for 10 years. And so it might seem slightly strange, this is an external coach, I'm talking about internal coaching. I got particularly interested in internal coaching about 2 or 3 years ago when I led a piece of research for the EMCC, which was also part of my master's research, into particularly the ethical dilemmas that arise for internal coaches. So some of the material for today comes from that research, because that's part of what it feels like actually being an internal coach and the kind of experiences that people have as internal coaches. But today it's only a small part of what I'm talking about. Could I ask first of all, how many of you are internal coaches or working as internal coaches? Oh, fantastic. And how many of you work full-time as internal coaches? How many are part-time as opposed to doing it on top of the day job? How many of you are coaching internally and it's a recognised part of what you do, so it's part-time if you like? Thank you. And how many of you are in effect internal coaching on top of the day job? Thank you. Because my research had just about that kind of proportions actually, which is very, very few people actually are internal coaches full-time, and most are working as internal coaches in their organisations, but on top of another job. Now, let me start by just saying, what do we mean? What kind of definitions are we using? So, Frisch, who was the kind of granddaddy of research into internal coaching, is pretty much the first one who started doing some research in the area. So he talks about it being a one-on-one developmental intervention supported by the organisation and provided by a colleague of those coached, who is trusted to shape and deliver a programme yielding individual professional growth. And when you think about it, apart from the aspect that you're being coached by a colleague, that's pretty much a definition of coaching. Alison Carter, and she was writing in 2005, was basically saying the internal coach is comparable in every sense to the external coach, with the exception that the internal coach is an employee of the same organisation as their coachees. Now, some people argue with that second definition, because sometimes internal coaches are trained to do a narrower area of work, but actually most nowadays are actually being trained the same way as external coaches are. The point of putting up these definitions at this point, though, is I'm not talking today about manager as coach. So we're not talking about managers that use a coaching approach in their management role. So, given that I'm an external coach, you know, what's my credibility talking to you about internal coaching? Anyway, the research 2 years ago was with 123 internal coaches from over 40 organisations, and they were brilliant. It was a long questionnaire, and they not only stuck with it to the end, but they even gave lots of stuff in the sort of not elsewhere specified kind of sort of gather it all up question at the end of, you know, what has this questionnaire led you to think about? Lots and lots of wonderful information there too, so they were brilliant. Off the back of that, I produced an article for Coaching at Work, which I've got here and I'm going to give you later. This is from 2010, and it outlines the sort of key findings from the research. But also, over the last couple of years, I've done a lot of workshops with the alumni of various different organisations. Those 4 are just examples, and done lots of interviews with internal coaches. What's great for me is the fact that there are a lot of you here who are internal coaches, because what I'll be doing is really checking out with you whether the research holds good, as far as you're concerned, in practice. So what I'm aiming to do this morning is, first of all, I'm really taking 2 perspectives. One is the perspective of what it feels like to be an internal coach, so what the benefits and challenges are in being an internal coach. Because the thing is, the research all shows that it's rather more complex than being an external coach, because of the interweaving of relationships and internal politics and all sorts of things. So basically, I became a huge admirer of internal coaches, because it seems to me they do everything that external coaches do, but there's several additional layers of complexity that they have to deal with. So the first is looking at internal coaching from the perspective of the coach. And then the second is looking at it from the point of view of the organisation. So what can the organisation do to ensure that they support their internal coaches well, and that the internal coaching is as effective as it could be? So what are the factors contributing to effective delivery? Because one of the things that came out very clearly from the research was that there were quite a lot of internal coaches who were not actually being adequately supported by their organisations. And the reason why internal coaching has become so interesting to many of us is that there's a huge upwards trend in the degree to which organisations now are training up internal coaches. So it's important that those who are thinking about it at the moment have some kinds of guidelines as to, what are the best things that they could do to set it up in a way that supports their internal coaches best. I'm currently in the middle of writing a book about internal coaching, which is why it's so particularly helpful for me in the timing of this conference. So I want to try things out on you. And then thirdly, I'm going to be asking you as we go along. I mean, at any point, please do ask me anything, make any observation, at any time you like. I certainly don't want them all gathered up to the end. So do just interrupt whenever you like. But also, I will be basically checking stuff out with you. Is that okay? There's an agenda. It makes internal coaches decide to train as an internal coach and manage to find time for that too. And what people are saying to me is, first of all, they do get huge satisfaction out of helping people to realise their potential. Secondly, they are learning new skills. Many of them are managers, many of them begin to use their coaching as part of the way that they manage their own staff or any other interactions. I'm afraid my children now say things like, "Mum, I think you're doing some coaching now on me," and so which means I'm obviously not doing it subtly enough, clearly. But I think a lot of us begin to use coaching in a different way, in all sorts of relationships, and not just with our coaching clients. It can help with the day job. Also, it can help us understand the organisation better. Because if you're coaching someone in another part of the organisation, you get to know more about what's happening in that part of the forest. And equally, it extends people's networks. They not only meet their coaching client, but they may well do a triangular sort of contracting session with that client's boss as well. And they just basically get to know more people within the organisation. And many coaches feel that that's one of the benefits they get. And something that came out of my research very clearly was that sometimes people found that, I had comments like, "I'm only still in this company because I'm a coach and I get so much out of that." And some coaches clearly do actually find the coaching more fulfilling than the day job. Those people quite often at a certain point decide to go it alone and set up their own coaching business, but not necessarily. So can I check out with you, given that I've got a lot of internal coaches in the room. First, do you agree with those? And secondly, what else is there? What are the other benefits? What are the other reasons why you decided to do it?
I certainly agree with those, and I've noticed with our managers in training to foundation coaching skill, that they just love it. When they start to practice across the organisation, not one of them has ever said, "Where do I get the time from?" And that would normally be the first thing they would say is, you know, I haven't time, or what am I going to stop doing? They never say that.
Thank you.
Sorry, one thing perhaps, something that I've seen recently is where senior people within an organisation is being positioned as coaches. There's a question in my mind quite whether they're coaches or mentors, but coach is certainly the term that's being used. And in one organisation I'm working with, it's very much linked to bringing on talent.
Yeah.
And so the other benefit is about giving something back to the organisation and investing in the organisation as well as investing in the individual recipients.
I like it. So pretty altruistic driver, therefore.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably, you know, it's not every senior person volunteering, so there's brownie points for being, you know, one of those who does as well. It's not entirely like that.
Yes. Well, the brownie points one is an interesting one, actually. Do any of you feel that it was very much to your benefit in terms of, I don't know, appraisals or performance, sort of management or whatever? Did any of you feel that it was sort of considered a good thing by the organisation to train as an internal coach, and therefore it would be a good thing to do?
I think yes, from the organisation, not necessarily from the direct line manager that wants you to focus on something else.
Indeed. So did you have to negotiate quite hard with your line manager in order to make it?
Not really, but I there's always this underlying, that's actually what I think I want you to spend your time on, but I appreciate you doing it for the greater good or whatever.
Yes. Thank you.
I think there's a benefit missing from the organizational point of view, which is this point in time, it's a cost-effective solution.
Yes.
Because most of the time, actually, all the time I had to improvise myself as an internal coach was because there was no money to be spent.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, as far as the organisational benefits are concerned, I mean, you're absolutely right, and most of the literature suggests that the upwards trend in training internal coaches has been initially, anyway, driven by the need to save money on external coaching. It's only one of the drivers, but it's clearly quite an important driver in some organisations.
I would agree with the list, and you're being really true. I guess the first point is quite broad on helping people to realise their potential.
Yes.
There's a whole load of things, but I think the big thing just for me is helping people develop their insight. Actually, that for me is one of the biggest barriers to effective management in the organisation I'm in anyway, when managers don't see what it is that they need to be doing, if you like.
Yes.
But that's when the lines get a little bit blurred. So some people see coaching as a way of performance managing an individual, which clearly is not.
Quite.
You have to be quite firm in sort of clarifying with the individual what they want in mentoring, coaching, or to actually be managed.
Yes.
By their own management.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree.
I think when resources are tight, and there's not many who do coaching, I sometimes just wondering what the more benefits of doing coaching or actually learning, for example, in terms of the numbers that we can actually work with and develop benefit with. And I think certainly for more junior staff, maybe actually the approach is a good way of bringing people on, because the capacity to do the amount of coaching you will do on a normal basis can be quite difficult.
Yes. Thank you.
I think there's a piece as well. You mentioned that this is not about manager as coach, but as a signal back to the organisation, sorry, to the employees of the organisation, of where the organisation's at in terms of its belief and development and so forth. I think if it's well managed and this sort of profile this high, I think it could be a very powerful instrument, in terms of sort of things like retention and motivation, but also in terms of actually being a role model in terms of what is good practice for managing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And obviously there's been quite a lot being written at the moment about creating a coaching culture and how having a cohort of internal coaches being role models in that kind of way can help to move an organisation along in that direction. And then there's the challenges. I was interested in what you said there, actually, that not many of your coaches were saying actually the difficulty is fitting it in because motivation tends to be quite high. But I think it's still, it feels that it still is quite an issue for some. Certainly, I chair something called the EMCC's Coaching and Mentoring, in public sector coaching and mentoring network, and in those meetings, people are quite often saying, we've got a lot of internal coaches trained up, but now we are beginning to see them having difficulty in making the time available. So there are sort of different messages coming through there. Sometimes coaches feel isolated, feel unsupported, and feel they're not really getting the recognition, because depending on how the coaching has been set up, they may or may not have a means of getting feedback about how their coaching is doing. So they get performance managed in terms of their day job, but for the coaching that they're doing, they don't necessarily get very much feedback. In terms of recognition and sort of reward, if you like, I'd be really interested to hear from you as to whether in your organisation the mechanisms are quite good. Because obviously sometimes they may have a kind of evaluation framework of some kind, so at the end of a coaching assignment, feedback is sent back to the learning and development department or something. Sometimes it seems to be passed on to the coaches, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes that doesn't even exist as a process. What's your take on reward straight recognition?
This year at their annual staff conference they had a Coach of the Year award. So 1,200 people, that was Wembley Stadium, that was quite a significant move forward for us. And so you get 250 quid and a picture, that's cool.
Oh, wonderful. Brilliant, and it raises the whole profile of the
Totally.
coaching going on. Very good. Anybody else?
Sort of coming at it sort of sideways.
Yeah.
We sought to build an element of CPD, if you like, into the coaches, a network of coaches. And just recently, after 4 years of the first programme, we've looked at building through, it sounds odd, but point systems, things that they can do that gives them more recognition. So, I'm talking to a department about coaching, or writing something, as well as developing their actual coaching skill through and they all have supervision, so that helps them supported and with ethical dilemmas.
Yes.
Talk, that's with a training provider. So it comes at it sort of not,
Yes.
we give them a bonus, it's more, do they feel they're getting support for their development as a coach?
Yes. Thank you. So their needs are being recognised from that perspective. Their sort of development needs to be recognised. Yes. Anybody else? Any particular means that your organisation uses to simply, recognise and thank you for what you're doing? Okay. And then I've got here about dealing with ethical dilemmas. I need to come on to that in a moment. Because, as I say, I think just by the nature of being an internal coach, you're more likely to encounter dilemmas of one kind or another, whether it's to do with role conflict or, I'll come on to those in a moment. But anything else in terms of challenges?
It can be difficult to establish that sense of objectivity,
Yeah.
either in reality or perceived objectivity, because you very often know the person that your coachee is talking about, or you know the department they work in. Chances are you've got your own opinion. You might even have your own opinion of the person that you're now coaching.
Yes.
And you do have to coach yourself to put all of that to one side and still explore and remain open.
Absolutely. That sort of sense of independence, trying to keep one's independence and have a kind of Chinese wall around the middle of your head, as it were, I think can be really difficult, and was a particular area that coaches did highlight in terms of dilemmas. So it's not so much what do I do in that kind of dilemma, it's more how do I handle this coaching session given that they've just said they want to discuss a really difficult relationship we've got with someone who's actually my best friend at work, or somebody who I've worked with really closely for years, and as you say, have your own views on. So those sorts of dilemmas, I think, can come up quite a lot.
Did you find anything, Katharine, about status and credibility, particularly when internal coaches, at least on paper, are expected to coach those seniors there?
Yeah.
It's something that has come up in sort of some contexts I
Yes.
have.
Well, what they seem to be saying was that the issue was more one for the coach than for the coachee.
Yeah.
And that they might have a bit of concern before they began the coaching relationship as to whether it might be an issue, but that the coaching client didn't actually have an issue usually. So it was one of those things where it was just in the coach's head before the first session, and then once they got into it, it sort of went away as an issue. But there were only, for my 123 coaches that took part in that particular research, I think that only came up 4 or 5 times, that the issue of status, and it's the sort of prevailing theme seems to be that it's more an issue for the coach than the client. But it's a really small sample, isn't it? So, has anybody had that situation where they've been coaching someone senior?
I have a situation where I'm coaching people much more senior than myself.
Yeah.
I'm not. It's not called coaching. I don't coach. They wouldn't. It's not accepted for them to be coached by someone. So I do it. So it's. I mean, I don't get any recognition for it.
So you're doing it subtly. You're doing it as a sort of confidant, as opposed to having a
Exactly,
formal
yes.
title coach.
Yeah, there's no
Yeah.
formal title, but there'll be regular phone calls.
Mm.
And I'm doing it. And it's difficult at the end of the day to say, look, this is my results, because,
Yeah.
you know.
No, exactly.
It's not very formal, yes. What do they call it? We're just having a chat. And with one of them, it was quite interesting, the chief executive. I've been doing that for a couple of years, and then I recently organised external coaches when I'm on external coaches coaching him. He says, oh, this is what you were doing. And he hadn't realised, but the culture of the organisation is such that it's.
Yeah.
But it's
not
works.
acceptable.
So for me, that doesn't matter so much.
No,
I don't know
not
if it
fair.
affects the effectiveness. I don't think so.
It sounds as if you'll still be getting the satisfaction of knowing that you were doing something useful,
Yes.
as it were. So you're still getting the satisfaction, but it wouldn't necessarily be recognised in terms of whoever is the head of coaching in your organisation or
That's
whatever.
me, so
Well, there you go.
talk to myself about
Yes,
it.
yes, quite. I mean, the other thing was that in the research, 10% of the coaches in the sample said that they coached people on the board, and an extra 26% said that they coached people below the board. So that was just over a third were coaching at that kind of a level, which was interesting because other respondents were saying, in our organisation, the board gets external coaches, you know, full stop, sort of thing. So it does seem to vary quite a lot from organisation to organisation. But I know, I mean, the BBC was part of the research, and I know that Liz McCann certainly was coaching people on the board. So, you know, but how big a sort of proportion of the 10% that represented, I just don't know. But you know, a lot of it does go on. Let me move on to dilemmas, because those are the things that can catch internal coaches out, but actually, from my research, has shown that they tend to deal with them extraordinarily sensitively and diligently. So an ethical dilemma, the problem for which no choice seems completely satisfactory, since there are good but contradictory reasons to take conflicting and incompatible courses of action. We've all, I suspect, probably been there, having some kind of dilemma at some time, and part of what the research was about was, well, how can organisations best equip internal coaches so that they can deal with these situations when they arise, or how can they best help them in terms of contracting, say, so that fewer of them will arise. One thing that I'm not sure about is whether I thought there might be some kind of correlation. To begin with, I was thinking it would be useful to see if there was a correlation between how experienced a coach was and how likely they were to experience a lot of ethical dilemmas. But it can cut both ways, because part of dealing with an ethical dilemma is recognising that it is one. And if somebody is an inexperienced coach, they might actually not recognise that this is something that they ought to be really careful about, and therefore might think that they're not really encountering many, whereas a more experienced coach maybe more aware and therefore noticing them more. So no correlation emerged, because actually you could play the hypothesis either way as to whether people with experience are more or less likely to be encountering them. But what we're going to do was, I'm not going to go through all these because I've done half-day workshops just on that slide. We've only got an hour and a quarter. But these were of the something like 250 I think it was, dilemmas. In categorising them, these were the ones that were most commonly occurring. So as you can see, so it's third parties, often the line manager or sponsor, just in an informal way in the corridor, wondered how so-and-so was getting on in the coaching, or thinking about doing my my line reports, performance appraisal, wondered if you could feed in your views, and these sort of informal things, and coaches have to get very good at fending those sorts of inquiries off and just saying no, it's not appropriate. Lots of role conflict dilemmas, particularly if the coach is either working in HR or in learning and development, somewhere in the sort of in the middle of the organisation. Like somebody in HR who might be coaching, but also is asked to chair a grievance procedure, and their client is involved on one side or the other of the grievance procedure, those sorts of things. So coaches can find that there's role conflict. There's the issue that one of you raised about client wanting to discuss an issue involving someone who the coach knows well, and so it can become a dilemma of, can I be independent enough? Or should I actually be saying, well, I know that person really well, so I think maybe this is something you ought to take to someone else, or not. I mean, the thing about dilemmas is there's no right or wrong answer, is there? But there is a thought process that we need to go through in order to arrive at the one that will work best. The fourth section there, being told by the client about inappropriate behaviour by someone, with the coach not being able to act on it. Sadly, most of those examples were around bullying or harassment of some kind, where the coach was doing their best, as one would, to try and encourage the client to address the issue, but sometimes the client just didn't feel it was in their best interest to raise it, and then the coach is basically having to sit with the information they've got and that they can't really do anything about. People deal with that situation in very different ways. There's clients' personal issues affecting their performance, them telling the coach about it but not wanting the line manager to know, even though the coach might think the line manager would be would deal with it sensitively, and it would explain to the line manager why that person was underperforming and having problems at the moment if they knew. So there are often kind of dilemmas in coaches' heads. Sometimes there are relationships between two different coaching clients being coached by the same coach, and so you feel as if you're sort of pulling the strings of how the encounters should be, or how the client might decide to deal with the next encounter. Yes.
As an external coach, I recognise some of these, but by no means all.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether you think that contracting by internal coaches needs to be different to contracting by an external coach.
When it comes to things like confidentiality, it does feel as though, some organisations certainly like their coaches to contract, not just everything's confidential, unless I think you might have harmed yourself or others, or there's some criminal act, but it's confidential unless you tell me something which suggests you're actually breaking some organisational policy. And some, the Met Police is one, you know, why am I saying so? It's just a fact. They have that variety of contracting, so that they are less likely to get into the dilemma of being told something and thinking, do I blow the whistle or not? Having said that, it's pretty rare that anybody ever does blow a whistle. But in terms of the level of contracting around confidentiality, I think sometimes it can be quite a bit sort of narrow, if you like, the area covered by the confidentiality in some organisations, partly to protect the coach, actually. And as long as you're very clear at the beginning, then if you're doing something that breaks an organisational policy, then don't bring it into the session. But
what if you're told that by your client that somebody else is breaking an organisational policy? Where do you go then with your contract on confidentiality?
Well, indeed. Where would you? I mean, it's, as with all these things, it would possibly depend on the way the internal coaching program would be set up. So have you got a lead coach where you can have a really confidential conversation with them and say, I mean, I'm not sure how to deal with this. Would it be something to take to supervision to try and work out what the best course of action is? Do the ethical codes help in any way? It would depend what the thing was, I suspect, how serious it was, and the degree to which you felt. I mean, in many contracting conversations, you say, and everything's confidential, but I may take this, what you're talking about, supervision, but I won't be identifying you. So, anybody else's thoughts on that issue of how you deal with a hearsay, as it were, but hearsay that suggests that someone is actually doing something quite seriously wrong within the organisation?
I think it's really difficult. I mean, the examples of sort of bullying, harassment, potentially the organisation's at risk.
Yep.
It's not just the individual. And so, I mean, I don't think I'm an answer, but it's being aware that you have at least two clients.
Yes.
One the individual, one the organisation, and it depends a bit on, I think the answer is the more you can talk this through with whoever your contact is in the organisation beforehand. But it's the thing about ethical dilemmas, there wouldn't be dilemmas if you could predict them, would they? Because you'd sort it out beforehand.
Exactly.
So that dialogue when things happen seems to be important as well.
Yeah.
And one of the clients in the organization, I think, has to be HR, especially for these kind of issues. You need to think if you're a coach and you come across something like that, you need to escalate that.
Yeah.
Even if there's confidentiality.
I mean, when I come on to the organisational perspective, having the best sort of support coaches, the whole issue of how much guidance organisations give coaches, I mean, that is hugely wide spectrum. In some organisations, they train them and just say, off you go, and that's pretty much it. The contracting, they will contract in the way they were taught during their training, which might or might not be the same. They may not all be getting the same training. They might never have anything written from the organisation to say these are our expectations of you, these are the issues we expect you to cover in contracting, these are the policies we expect you to abide by, which will also support them at the same time. So the whole issue of how clear things are for coaches varies hugely from organisation to organisation as to what's expected of them. And where that's the case, it's even more important, of course, that they have some kind of supervision or action learning set, or some coaching buddy, with some sort of a sort of colleague who can help to bounce ideas off and to try and come to a decision as to how they're going to take things forward. This one's quite common, knowing something about the client's future they don't know, you can't tell them, or you get told by HR or the person's boss or something, and say, oh, but I don't want you to tell the client. So it was an external coach, and certainly, I mean, like you, Steve, actually, I mean, a lot of these, particularly if you coach in an organisation as an external coach and you've coached them for some time, so you actually know quite a lot of people in the organisation, at that point you hit the same sorts of issues as an internal coach does, because the interweaving of relationships. Being unable to use information that could benefit the organisation, that came up quite a few times as well, like people hearing from their client that, or coaches hearing from their client that maybe a whole group of employees are going to actually leave the organisation and go and set off somewhere else, and they're all going to leave together, and you know, that was one of the examples that came up, and that was a real dilemma for the coach because they knew it would have a big impact on the organisation. Clients attempting to use sessions to further their own agenda through influencing the coach. So they actually select a coach because they can see they're in an area where they want to influence them. And this one, which I think is probably, I would be surprised if there's anybody who hadn't come across that one at some point, and it's certainly been very common in my external coaching practice, where at some point during the relationship, they actually want you to coach them through the process of finding a job somewhere else. So those were the sorts of areas that came up. And so how can organisations help, or how can coaches help themselves to address ethical dilemmas of one kind or another? Well, obviously there are codes of ethics. How many of you are members of one of the professional bodies? Well, how many of you are members of the EMCC, first of all? Association of Coaching? ICF? Anybody here who isn't a member of a professional body yet? Okay. Yeah, oh sorry, I didn't mean that, yes, thank you. Because even if you're not yet, then looking at their codes of ethics can be very helpful. But it's only broad, it's only broad principles in codes of ethics. So if you've got a real dilemma, it can be useful to read one first and just think, yes, actually, if I did X, would that really fit with this code? So depending on what the issue is, maybe sometimes it could be helpful. But there are other approaches too. I'm going to hand out to you at the end, one approach by Michael Carroll, who's a quite well-known supervisor. And what he, well actually I might give these out now. He calls his the action framework. It's an acronym, as it were. And I think A is for awareness. So first of all, you need to be aware of what your own values and ethics are, and also be aware of any codes of ethics that may be around, either from your own professional body or one that you like the look of. And then, so that's awareness, and then the C is around classifying, is this a real ethical dilemma or not? And then anyway, the general idea is it's just like any kind of solution framework really, which is, what is the issue? Generating options, what are my options for dealing with this? Where I find Michael's pretty good actually and helpful is the degree to which, if you look at the sort of number 4 about taking to supervision, talking with a colleague and starting with managers, consultant lawyer, but it's fitting in that brainstorm, number 5 phase, and also number 6, which is actually what are the implications for the client, for maybe the organisation, and for you as coach of any of these options. Because just really thinking through what those implications are, and then obviously making the decision and implementing it. And then number 9 is living with the ambiguities. So that's the Michael Carroll approach, and it's just, it's straightforward, but it helps you to really sort of think around all possibilities. The Edwina Curry approach was that she, years ago, I ran a course for something called the Civil Service College, which then became the National School of Government, and Edwina Curry used to come and talk to our people about what it's like being a minister, so we're talking about 25 years ago or something. And she said that her approach to ethical dilemmas was to think of the different ways that she could address the issue, and then when she'd selected the one that she thought was best, to think, if this was put on the front of the Daily Mail, would I be embarrassed? And actually, there's something to be said for that straightforward one. Or if your colleagues knew what decision you'd taken, you know, what the situation was and how you dealt with it, would you actually be embarrassed by it? And I find that a pretty good rule of thumb, quite honestly, because as long as you have a rationale which is defensible, then the odds are you're probably coming to the, you know, as good a solution as you might. We were talking a bit earlier about contracting. I do feel really strongly about the importance of organisations giving their coaches guidance around contracting, because there are loads of organisations where internal coaches all just use their own approach. You know, they may have been trained at different times by different people, different organisations, and they may actually include different things in their contracting. There may not really be any consistency across the piece. And without sounding horribly judgmental, I do feel it's, you know, really not stepping up to their obligations as an organisation, not to have some kind of guidance of coaches, a sense of what your expectations of the coaches are, of what the coaches' expectations of you can be, and guidance around certain things, and particularly contracting. I'm going to come on to organisational policies in a moment, because quite often those haven't been thought through either. And that bit is not in any way dissing organisations. It's actually, you know, often they're doing it off the back of an envelope sort of thing. You know, they've been given hardly any money to set it up in the first place, and you know, some coaching is better than no coaching, as far as I'm concerned. But often organisations don't actually give the investment to setting the thing up properly. Then also the last one is just simply the importance of having access to supervision. Sometimes some of the people saying the way they dealt with dilemmas was basically to go and talk to the lead coach about it, and to talk it through with that person. Action learning sets are a terrific way of having a number of different brains acting on a particular issue and talking it through. Now, I thought we might have an ethical dilemma that you might discuss, just to bring it all to life, although I'm sure you've all had real live ones. This one's actually taken, I don't know if any of you remember of the British Psychological Society's special group on coaching psychology, but I do recommend this out for any. It's something like 15 quid to join the BPS, British Psychological Society, as an affiliate. And then an extra, I think last year it was an extra £4 on top of that to belong to their special group on coaching psychology. And they do a fantastic conference, and they have a wonderful little journal on here, Coaching Psychologist. This comes out sort of 2 or 3 times a year. It has academic articles in it, but it also has a very nice ethics column. And it's just so cheap, I just can't believe it. So I'll just mention that to anybody if you're thinking of joining something. It's prices on. Yes, I'm certainly publicising them. So this is one simply taken from the ethics column in 2009. So HR have asked you to work with Jonathan. So you've had an initial meeting with him, and he said, yeah, you know, what I want to be coached on is I want to make transition to partnership. So that's what I want our goal to be. And then the boss rings up and says, just need a word with you quickly before I think you're meeting Jonathan tomorrow, aren't you? Can I just have a quick word with you beforehand? And you say, would it be better if it was a 3-cornered thing? And he says, no, Jonathan's not in today, and I know you're seeing him tomorrow morning, but can I just have a quick word on the phone or whatever? So you do. And he says, well, Jonathan's actually on a yellow card, which means he's heading for a formal warning. I haven't told Jonathan, he says, but you need to know this. You need to know. So, what are the issues that this story raises? Does it press any hot buttons for you? Who do you see as the client? And what are you going to do? So would you like to split into twos and have a conversation for a few minutes? Do you want to talk to me?
Gut feel can be pretty handy though.
I suppose it's about
the yellow card. And obviously knowing that, to be honest, I'm not
how are you going to go about coaching if actually they're not talking about their performance in any kind of remedial way, it's simply talking about progression, when you know actually they need to be, that that's all, there's no foundation to that, and that you're not going to be able to take them anywhere. But they need to be addressing the remedial stuff. I think I'd be actually saying to the partner, whoever it is, he really has to talk to Jonathan, because you cannot meaningfully coach him if he is coming out of some totally false premises. The organisation needs to be honest with him about why he's getting what the issues are. That's just a good thing. That's what that would raise for me.
Yeah.
That's a practical thing, that's not really ethics what we're talking about now. Well, on a practical basis, I think that would be my instinct.
Mine too. I guess one of the principles that guides me is that as a coach, I try not to make up for organisational deficiencies. And one of the deficiencies there is about plain and honest speaking. So I think it's interesting how Katharine framed it, because I think my response would be, okay, let's have a three-way conversation. And if it's the afternoon before you've already booked to see Jonathan, you're not going to get the three-way conversation. Your counsellor with Jonathan is going to want an explanation. So it is, I think it's very difficult.
If HR have asked you to work with him,
Yeah.
either it was a totally dysfunctional relationship going on here, or actually HR asking you to work with him because there's an issue around, his manager must be talking to HR, or will you assume that I'm reading that into that? Because he approached HR and said, I want some coaching to go to.
Yeah, no, I think
I want to be a partner.
I think that's an important point. And there's so many ethical dilemmas. The somewhat glib answer is don't go there. Don't end up there. And I think, as you say, the more, particularly when you're coming through that route, the question is, what's the basis for the referral?
What's going on here?
What issues does this story raise for you?
Well, my first take is what's actually going on here. Some of it don't know the context, but is HR just a conduit through which coachees identify a coach? Because as soon as HR have asked to have a word with Jonathan, now is there a fix-in issue going on there? Don't know. Right. Jonathan clearly has a perception about his potential, which we don't actually know whether that's aspirational, or whether it's in cuckoo land, or actually he is a high flyer, in which case, what's that all about in terms of what's going on? And then, yes, where's this boss thing come in? So,
Indeed. So those are the issues it's raising for you. Does anybody have any issues other than those that it's raised for them?
I think that those are all important issues. The one thing for me is I know how much information that the client doesn't have gets in my way when I'm coaching them. And so the big issue for me is authenticity. I can't be authentic with that information and the other not having it. I have to find a way through that. And I think there's sort of practical questions about what's going on anyway. Absolutely right.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that guides me towards is, I hope, and you framed it nicely, because sometimes these things come out of left field. Ideal three-way meeting. No, I haven't got time for that. Let me just tell you something. It's exactly what happens. But I think that takes me towards not seeing Jonathan, saying, I'm getting mixed messages about what the drivers here are. This is something we need to sort before we can work together. And he'd probably ask, well, what messages you're getting, and then it gets harder, I know, but I think you have to do something, well, I would have to do something like that.
Yes, I think that the issue around authenticity, and how one can actually separate the knowledge one has from a really proper connection with the client. What about, does it press any hot buttons for you? So are there any aspects of that where you're thinking, oh God, typical HR, they're just passing it on, or is it quite the reverse? Is the more an issue of, oh good heavens, the line manager once again hasn't been keeping HR in touch with what's going on? I mean, are there any particular hot buttons for you that have come from your experience of working in organisations that might actually mean that you're sort of oversensitive about any of this, or?
I think the fact that Jonathan is the last to know that there's a yellow card is very typical.
Yes, thank you. Yes.
It was a completely different thing for me, a personal one. Well, yeah, I'm on the side of the loser here, so I'm going to coach him and make sure that he does get that card.
Yes, there you go. You're supporting the underdog. Yes.
That would be I didn't think about that reaction, but
yes.
might be the first reaction when
I mean, my other take would be, hang on a minute, if the arrangement, the understanding I've got with Jonathan is about helping his transition into partnership, for all I know, the formal warning is about nicking stuff, which is a completely different issue and irrelevant to our discussion about, I don't know.
What
I mean,
a good
all
point,
right,
you're
there's
right.
got some
No, you're quite
clear
right.
implications for him, but what am I
Yes.
actually, what's the deal I've got with the client? And although it's relevant to his career
Yeah.
in his organisation, if it's fact, in terms of what we're talking about, it's nothing to do with the contract.
Yeah.
And are the boss
that's
and
pretty
HR
easy.
seeing him the same as well? Because it could be that actually the organisation does see him as partnership material. They're on board with this coaching. There's a conflict between him and his boss, and the boss is getting the coach in to just say, actually, no, and actually that's not the organisation's perception.
It is.
So you'd have to make sure that there was clarity there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Who do you see as a client in all this? Is it Jonathan? Is it his boss? Is it HR?
Jonathan. Jonathan, definitely. Because if nothing else, he's not being performance managed very well. So he's, whatever happens to him, he's actually going to need some coaching support to deal with it.
Right. I would see HR as well as a client.
Mm-hmm.
Mainly because the demand most of the times come through them. Also, they are if you use them in the correct way, they will actually help you gather the information and avoid that disconnection that is happening.
Yes. Yes.
I think there's a little bit of non-communication happening, obviously, between the boss and Jonathan.
Yeah.
With the boss and HR, presumably.
Yeah. And maybe HR and coach as well. It's difficult to know who's doing the, yes, until I've unpacked it, there are loads of different interpretations, which of course is partly what dilemmas are all about, is often about how one is interpreting the information. I just realised I've only got another 20 minutes, so I'm going to go to the organisational side. So I'm just going to quickly read you because Marion Gilly, who some of you may know, who's written a lot about ethical issues, was the one who contributed this particular one. She's put here the issue. So who do you see as your client, your coachee or the sponsor? And what buttons does this press for you? For example, feelings of being used or manipulated by the boss or by HR? What do you see as the boundaries between coaching and line management? One option would be to be clear with the boss. This is a line management issue, i.e. it's their job to exit people, not yours. Explore with the boss their reasons for not being upfront with your coachee. And a further option would be to offer a three-way meeting to explore this between the manager and the coachee. And honestly, I think that may be the best way forward, perhaps. Then support the coachee in either exiting with dignity or doing what is required of them to stay. However, if the boss refuses to be upfront with your coachee and you can't disclose the situation to your coachee, you may consider withdrawing from the contract, which I think is probably your one, isn't it? Being very difficult to be authentic otherwise. You may also want to find out how much of this HR knew when putting you in front of the client in the first place. So there are just all sorts of things to be kind of explored there, aren't there? But things along those kinds of lines are not that uncommon in my experience. I've certainly come across it as an external coach.
What you said about how well you know the organisation and your history there matters
Yeah.
as well, because if this is my first client in an organisation, one set of possibilities arise. If I work for this organisation for 3 years, know HR, know how they work, know what the sorts of clients, then the organisation's my client in a much stronger sense, and I would feel both the responsibility and the capability to work with the organisation in a sense around what's happening here. So it can shift quite radically.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. I'm going to press on because this is more the organisational perspective now. So it's what are the factors that contribute to effective delivery, and I'm not of coaching, and I'm going to go through these ones at a pretty rapid rate to get into some of the more important ones. But first of all, is there a thought-through coaching strategy? Because there are lots of organisations out there that just think external coaching too expensive. We need to develop some internal coaches, give them some training, off they go, without really thinking through, what's the purpose of the coaching? Are we targeting around particular people, like to develop talent? How does it fit in with our organisational strategy and our talent management strategy and our OD strategy? How does it all fit together? Is the purpose clear, both to the people who are funding it, i.e. the board, is the board involved, and do they understand what the purpose of it is? Is there support and sponsorship from the top? Is there one person responsible for coaching output? Because there's a lot of literature now which suggests that it's really, really important that the external coaching and the internal coaching is in the hand, there's somebody at the top of it who is doing that balancing act. Is there adequate training and support for the coaches, e.g. supervision and CPD? And I have a massive chapter on supervision and CPD in the book actually, because that too is very interesting for internal coaching. Whether the supervisor is an internal supervisor or whether it's an external one, and what the pros and cons of each. Supervision groups, the problems that can sometimes be with confidentiality when you have supervision groups, if people know who each other is coaching. There's a lot to think through with in supervision for internal coaches, and sometimes organisations are galloping along so fast they just don't manage to do that thinking. But also, have a variety of policies being discussed and communicated to the coaches, because there are all sorts of aspects here that people don't always have a chance to think through properly. Peter Hawkins, who wrote Creating Coaching Culture this year, or it was published this year. Now this feels to me like quite an aspiration actually. A good coaching strategy should be firmly grounded in the organisational mission, the current business strategy, the organisational development plan, and linked to all the people development policies, leadership, management, and talent. And some people would say, oh, dream on, But it's an aspiration. So I can see, yes, it makes complete sense that these things should all fit together, but you've often got one person who's responsible for coaching the organisation who's just beginning to build it up and everything, and it's a lot to put on them. The other thing is this business strategy. It feels to me as if it's a missed trick, particularly if you have an internal coaching cohort, not to actually talk to the coaches about the context, what current thinking is, and so on. If there's some sort of change thing going on, well, or some of those organisations may have recently done work on their organisational values or something. Well, why not actually put that up front with the coaches and say, look, these are the behaviours that we all agree we're looking for now. So when you're doing your coaching, can you actually have an eye to those behaviours and see, so that you can sort of point up to the client, if you like, well, I know you're planning to do X, but these new behaviours that we're talking about, that we're trying to instill in the organisation, does it really chime with those? The contextual piece, I think, is often missing, whereas it's perfect you've got a lot of internal coaches and they're sitting there available to be talked to about the context, and it just feels as if there's a bit of a missed trick often. So the different elements, we'll get into some of the elements, what's it for, how can it be aligned with business needs, who's the coaching for, what do you want your coaches to know? So this is sort of training really. What level of training do you want? And obviously training is an entire huge field of its own. Are you going to train them internally? Are you going to have them all doing the same training? Are you going to have, specially custom built training for your new? Or are you just going to send out an email saying, is anybody already a trained coach? Because we'd like to, gather you together and can you do some coaching within the organisation where they all may have different qualifications, different approaches, different everything. There's that issue about how you're going to support your coaches, supervision, CPD, maybe an action learning set, buddies, whatever. How you're going to reward them, even if it's a thank you, and or best coach of the year, which sounds absolutely brilliant to me. And of course the really important one about how coaching will be evaluated, which is a whole big area in itself. During the research, I asked people, reflecting on your initial training, to what extent do you feel it equipped you to deal with the ethical dilemmas you've encountered? And as you see, about a third thought that their training had been really good on that front. Just under a half weren't quite so sure, and about 15% felt, no, it hadn't really. I also asked, reflecting on the support you get from your organisation, to what extent do you feel it equips you on an ongoing basis to deal with ethical dilemmas? As you see, slightly better scores there, but nonetheless, around a sixth would have liked better training around ethics, and a quarter would have welcomed more support on an ongoing basis. So it feels there's still a bit of work to be done there. And then these are examples of the kind of support that was provided. So, as you see, I mean, sort of 4 of those, around a bit more or a bit less than half the people who responded said that they did have shared learning opportunities, as a coaching network, CPD, one-to-one supervision, group supervision, and so on. And some of them had action learning sets. You know, even having a kind of some kind of email group to support each other is better than nothing if an organisation has very little money to actually invest in supporting their coaches, or having a coaching buddy. But I just felt very sorry for the 8% where there was nothing at all. But the other whole area was coaching policies. So the whole issue of more personal issues be on or off the agenda is just a really, really interesting one, because there seems to be a big mismatch between the coaches themselves and their organisations. So in my research, I asked the question about, you know, are issues, you know, unconnected to the workplace be part of your coaching? And 92% said yes. And the reasons being that you want to be holistic, or you know, things outside can often affect their effectiveness at work, and so on. But when I fed this back to a group of employers, they were saying, we didn't invest in our coaches so that they can be talking to them about stuff unrelated to the workplace. So it's just, I think it's important that organisations actually think through what is it that they're going to be, that their coaches are going to be doing. At least who've done the thinking. Alison Carter did, about 2 or 3 years ago, did some research where she analysed the goals of 88 internal coachees. And I think it was roughly average of 2.5 objectives per coachee. So she had, whatever 2.5 times 88 is, but anyway, a bit more than 200. Only 17% of those individual goals, or sort of coaching objectives, were actually related to sort of the business itself. But in a way, and when she reported that back to the organisation, they were sort of completely horrified. You know, it wasn't aligned with specific business objectives. But when you saw what the things were that we were working on, you know, confidence and self-esteem, and you know, there were lots of things which, as we all know as coaches, really, really do underpin whether people are effective at their jobs or not. So I just think organisations need to be a bit, you know, think about this more, about the degree to which what they think of as personal issues and the extent to which they're happy for their coaches to be working on them. There are all sorts of things like, you know, what do you do with your records? Do you destroy them immediately after? Is there a policy on what you do with records? I had one coach who was very, very senior, and she came in one morning and found her PA, you know, she just kept her records in her filing cabinet, and her PA was sort of leafing through her coaching notes with her senior coaching clients. And, you know, she just come across them by chance. She wasn't doing it in any, you know, she just, well, I don't know if she's doing it by chance or not, but the point is that it's really important what you do with your coaching records, whether you have them under lock and key, whether you destroy them immediately afterwards, whether they go to learning and development, go somewhere central to be kept. But it's just the organisation needs to think about that sort of thing. And often they don't. I think something like 20% of the people in my research said there was any kind of policy over what happened to the records. You know, things like referrals, where do you refer people to? Things like, will supervision and CPD be, you know, sort of available to the coaches as a present, as it were, or is it actually an obligation? The BBC certainly, for many years, says supervision and CPD, you must attend them if you're going to continue coaching. It was actually an obligation, whereas I know quite a few organisations at the moment are saying, well, the trouble is that people aren't really coming to the CPD much because they'd love to, but they just can't make the time available. You're thinking, well, you know, it's just stuff to be thinking about. Whether line managers are part of the contracting process, are the coaches going to be given membership of a professional body? It's not that expensive. It's something, you know, I think the MCC is £100 a year or something. It's not that much, and yet you get so much for it. Is the organisation going to have an ethical code, a complaints process? And the real biggie, which I'm really looking forward to writing this chapter, is about the organisational learning, because there are loads of issues in there about, you know, is it you get the supervision group and the supervisor collects organisational learning, you know, sort of systemic issues that are coming up. Who do they feed them back to? What do they do with them? I was talking to an organisation recently who said, oh, every quarter we feed it back. I said, where do you feed it back to? And he said, OD. I said, is anybody in OD I can talk to? And I talked to the person in OD and she said, oh, it's all very interesting, but no, we don't do anything with it at all. You're thinking, oh, okay, that's a bit of a wasted process then. So, you know, I think there's just a lot of things that the organisations do need to think through before they really get weaving. And one of the drawbacks of just saying, go for it. Oh yes, sorry.
I was interested to know your perspective now on the one about involving the line managers.
Yes, because some people do, I mean, some organisations do say we want a triangular meeting at the beginning of the coaching exercise and the line manager be involved, and others don't. Well, what is other people's experience?
I would be in favor. I think it's best practice.
Yeah. Anybody else? Do you do that in the ambulance service?
We rarely, I think.
It's usually a certain relationship between you and the coaching client.
Yeah, I can see loads of benefits to it, and I can see loads of potential drawbacks to it. I guess it's one of those situations that will depend each time.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, some of my managers want to get involved and some don't, I think as well. I mean, you could say, given that how you know, that some coaching is better than no coaching, and one doesn't want to create this huge bureaucracy around it. So the sorts of things that I think organisations ought to think through ideally. There are a lot of them, and it feels to me that it's very valuable if they do, but there are some organisations that just can't be doing with all that superstructure. They just want more coaching going on. The drawbacks of that are that you don't really know what your coaches are doing. I mean, you know, because you might just have names of coaches, internal coaches on the intranet or something, and just say if you want a coach, contact one of them, and if they haven't got any time, they contact another, you know. And so it's just a kind of very hands-off, do-it-yourself sort of thing. But you don't then know what your coaches are doing. You're not getting the potential benefits of supporting the business strategy, which you get if you actually got them together regularly. You're not gleaning organisational learning. If the coaching relationship goes wrong, you really can be quite badly unstuck, because you don't really know who's coaching whom anyway, and when it happens, you're so hands-off that things can go quite badly wrong. You're not helping your coaches to grow and develop, because you're not providing CPD or supervision or anything. The coaches could go off-piste. I mean, they could just start, in terms of ethical dilemmas and the way they handle ethical issues and so on. Well, if you don't know who they are and what they're doing, you know, anything could happen. But also, there's no evaluation of outcomes or value for money, and that seems a shame too. I mean, there are all sorts of arguments around whether one does ROI, you know, return on investment in this sort of area, but there are other ways of evaluating success of coaching programs. And if you're just having a laissez-faire approach, then you don't get any of that information. So as I say, there still could be good work going on. So it's not as if, you know, let's say their approach is completely appalling, it just seems to miss a lot of tricks. Because there still could be lots of good work being done, but you just simply, how will you know whether it is or not? So to conclude, I feel very strongly that internal coaching is terrific, and that, you know, both the organisations, the coaches and the coachees can all benefit hugely from it, and there are loads and loads of examples of that. But I do feel that the strategy needs to be thought through, and that organisations probably just don't really get enough help in the sorts of issues they need to be thinking through before they set up an internal coach resource. The policies too need to be thought through, you know, whether it's keeping records, whether it's how contracting is done, whether you're going to be involving the line manager or not, loads and loads of policies that wouldn't take a lot of sorting out, but they just need to be thought through and written down. Coaches do need to be properly and supported, and from that slide of how many different ways in which coaches can be supported, they're not all horribly expensive. You could have somebody who's trained as an action learning facilitator, maybe who's worked in L&D or HR anyway, who might be able to do, you know, every 2 or 3 months, facilitate an action learning set in a lunch hour or something. You know, it doesn't have to be incredibly expensive to provide support to your coaches. The EMCC at the moment, I co-chair something called the Internal Coaching Special Interest Group, and at the end of this month they're revamping their whole website, and there's going to be a whole section on internal coaching and support for internal coaches. We're putting on there a draft contract that internal coaches can use, and we're also putting together a kind of database of research on internal coaching, particularly things that don't normally see the light of day, like dissertations. We've gone out to all the universities saying, if you have any master's students who've done a dissertation relating specifically to internal coaching, can we publicise it, make it available? So that's what we're going to have on that internal coaching website, or sort of part of the MCC website. And then finally, next year my book Internal Coaching Making It Work will be published. If any of you just are remotely interested in my sending you a flyer, which you can then bin next year when it comes out, so that I can alert you to it, please do give me your business card. I mean, we all get so many emails about so many things, but if you would find that helpful, I would be very happy to do that. Thank you very much. Are there any other thoughts before we've got 3 minutes? Yes.
Can we go back one slide to,
yeah.
I think it was one. Yes.
Yep.
All I would add is, with the best intent, is, and if ever there's an example of where, for external coaching, executive coaching, because that's all of that, yes? It's for me, I'm big, powerful and important, I'll buy who I want to talk about what I want, where and how I want,
Yeah.
but the organisation funds me.
Yeah.
So I think there's some discipline, you know, that needs to be brought in.
I think that's an extremely good point. And when I was mentioning a bit about CPD and supervision and so on, one of the things I would say to organisations is, if you expect your external coaches to have supervision and CPD, which most of them do, it's usually as part of a selection process, then surely you should be offering the same or better to your internal coaches. But you're right, that's exactly what happens with external coaches.
It's not about the quality of the coaching.
No,
it's
it's
just
about
the
the
arrangement.
Yeah, yes, quite. No, I agree. You're absolutely right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. You've been a lovely audience.